Well, joining us via Skype now is Dina Rezk. She is a lecturer in Middle Eastern history at the University of Reading. Thanks so much for speaking to us, Dina. There have now been weeks of protests, as we said, outrage on behalf of most of the international community. But how much momentum do you think is really necessary to make this movement and these protests count?
I mean, I think that's a very good question. There has been a clear sort of sense of outrage amongst the international community in terms of condemning Israeli retaliation to protests in Gaza. But the question is, what can follow from that? So if the US is, for example, vetoing a UN Security Council sort of appeal to investigate the use of force by the Israeli military, what can in fact be done beyond simply expressions of solidarity with the Palestinians?
That is the problem, and the worry is that, somewhat irreversible damage has been done now. Do you think that is the case, or is there a way to salvage peace talks, perhaps via what we're seeing in Istanbul today in the meeting of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation that President Erdogan has called?
Well, I think that certainly the idea of the US as a broker or as a mediator in the peace process is, for the moment, dead and buried. The question is what other states, Arab states, what role they can play in terms of pushing forward negotiations. I imagine that these sort of large-scale, more symbolic expressions of solidarity, I think, are going to be less useful than smaller-scale diplomatic negotiations, potentially enacted by states such as Egypt, who have historically had a contentious but important role in negotiating and managing relations between Palestine and Israel. That could potentially be important. And we've seen, for example, President Sisi open the Rafah crossing with Gaza for the month of Ramadan in a move that seems to indicate a desire to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians and potentially play this historic role of mediator between Israel and Palestine. So that is one option.
So, but Dina, aside from the international response here, let's talk about what's on the ground now in Palestine. Who's really leading this movement among Palestinian protesters and others? Or is this kind of the first time we've seen just a completely civil movement among Palestinians?
It's very difficult to say what exactly is happening on the ground. I mean, Hamas have clearly stated themselves that a good proportion of the individuals targeted by the Israelis were Hamas members. Yes, there were clearly elements of civil protesters as well. But, what we're seeing in Gaza is also, to some extent, the culmination of a long-term build-up of tension, of a really sort of dreadful humanitarian situation where access to medical treatment, electricity and clean water is still, not a reality for most Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. Incredibly high levels of unemployment. So these are all longer-term issues that are provoking the sorts of protests that we saw earlier this week, and perhaps we'll continue to see, whereby the embassy move was an important and significant trigger, but not necessarily the underlying cause.
Okay, Dina, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for sharing your insight.